The Tenerife Airport disaster was a fatal runway collision between two Boeing 747s on March 27, 1977 at Los Rodeos Airport on the Spanish island of Tenerife, one of the Canary Islands. The crash killed 583 people, making it the deadliest accident in aviation history. A bomb explosion at Gran Canaria Airport, and the threat of a second bomb, caused many aircraft to be diverted to Los Rodeos Airport. Among them were KLM Flight 4805 and Pan Am Flight 1736, the two aircraft involved in the accident. At Los Rodeos Airport, air traffic controllers were forced to park many of the airplanes on the taxiway, thereby blocking it. Further complicating the situation, while authorities waited to reopen Gran Canaria, a dense fog developed at Tenerife, greatly reducing visibility. When Gran Canaria reopened, the parked aircraft blocking the taxiway at Tenerife required both of the 747s to taxi on the only runway in order to get in position for takeoff. The fog was so thick that neither aircraft could see the other, nor could the controller in the tower see the runway or the two 747s on it. As the airport did not have ground radar, the only means for the controller to identify the location of each airplane was via voice reports over the radio. As a result of several misunderstandings, the KLM flight attempted to take off while the Pan Am flight was still on the runway. The resulting collision destroyed both aircraft, killing all 248 aboard the KLM flight and 335 of 396 aboard the Pan Am flight. 61 people aboard the Pan Am flight, including the pilots and flight engineer, survived the disaster. As the accident occurred in Spanish territory, that nation was responsible for investigating the accident. Investigators from the Netherlands and the United States also participated. The investigation revealed that the primary cause of the accident was the captain of the KLM flight taking off without clearance from air traffic control. The investigation specified that the captain did not intentionally take off without clearance. Rather, he fully believed he had clearance to take off due to misunderstandings between his flight crew and ATC. Dutch investigators placed a greater emphasis on this than their American and Spanish counterparts, but ultimately KLM admitted their crew was responsible for the accident, and the airline financially compensated the victims' relatives. The accident had a lasting influence on the industry, particularly in the area of communication. An increased emphasis was placed on using standardized phraseology in ATC communication by both controllers and pilots alike, thereby reducing the chance for misunderstandings. As part of these changes, the word takeoff was removed from general usage, and is only spoken by ATC when actually clearing an aircraft to take off. Less experienced flight crew members were encouraged to challenge their captains when they believed something was not correct, and captains were instructed to listen to their crew and evaluate all decisions in light of crew concerns. This concept was later expanded into what is known today as crew resource management. CRM training is now mandatory for all airline pilots. Flight history: for both planes, Tenerife was an unscheduled stop. Their destination was Gran Canaria International Airport, serving Las Palmas on the nearby island of Gran Canaria. Both are in the Canary Islands, an autonomous community of Spain located in the Atlantic Ocean off the southwest coast of Morocco. Pan Am Flight 1736 had originated at Los Angeles International Airport, with an intermediate stop at New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. The aircraft was a Boeing 747-121, registration N736PA, named Clipper Victor. Of the 380 passengers, 14 had boarded in New York, where the crew was also changed. The new crew consisted of Captain Victor Grubbs, First Officer Robert Bragg, and Flight Engineer George Walnes. There were 13 other crew members. The same aircraft had operated the inaugural 747 commercial flight on January 22, 1970. KLM Flight 4805, a charter flight for Holland International Travel Group, had arrived from Amsterdam Airport Schiphol, the Netherlands. Its captain was Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, KLM's chief flying instructor. The first officer was Klaas Meurs and the flight engineer was Willem Schroedner. The aircraft was a Boeing 747-206B, registration PHBUF, named Ridge. The KLM jet had 14 crew members and 235 passengers, including 52 children. Most of the KLM passengers were Dutch. 4 Germans, 2 Austrians and 2 Americans were also on the plane. After the aircraft landed at Tenerife, the passengers were transported to the airport terminal. One of the inbound passengers, who lived on the island, chose not to reboard the 747, leaving 234 passengers on board. Disaster, diversion of aircraft to Los Rodeos. Both flights had been routine until they approached the islands. At 1:15 p.m., a bomb exploded in the terminal of Gran Canaria International Airport, injuring 1 person. There had been a phone call warning of the bomb, and soon after another call claimed that a second bomb was at the airport. The civil aviation authorities had therefore closed the airport temporarily after the bomb detonated and diverted all of its incoming flights to Los Rodeos, including the 2 Boeing 747 aircraft involved in the disaster. The Pan Am crew indicated that they would prefer to circle in a holding pattern until landing clearance was given, but were ordered to divert to Los Rodeos. In all, 5 large aircraft were diverted to Los Rodeos, a regional airport that could not easily accommodate them. The airport had only 1 runway and 1 major taxiway parallel to it, with several small taxiways connecting the two. While waiting for Gran Canaria Airport to reopen, the diverted aircraft took up so much space that they were parked on the long taxiway, meaning that it could not be used for taxiing. Instead, departing aircraft had to taxi along the runway to position themselves for takeoff, a procedure known as a runway backtaxi or backtrack. After the threat at Gran Canaria had been contained, authorities reopened that airport. The Pan Am aircraft was ready to depart from Tenerife, but the KLM plane and a refueling vehicle obstructed its access to the runway. The Pan Am aircraft was unable to maneuver around the fueling KLM, reach the runway and depart due to a lack of just 12 LFT of clearance. Captain Veldhuis and Van Zanten had decided to fully refuel at Los Rodeos instead of Las Palmas, apparently to save time. The refueling took about 35 minutes. After that, the passengers were brought back to the plane. The search for a missing family of 4 delayed the flight even further. Taxiing and takeoff preparations. Following the tower's instructions, the KLM was cleared to taxi the full length of the runway and make a 180-degree turn to get into takeoff position. While the KLM was back taxiing on the runway, the controller asked the flight crew to report when it was ready to copy the ATC clearance. Because the flight crew was performing the checklist, copying this clearance was postponed until the aircraft was in takeoff position on runway 30. Shortly afterward, the Pan Am was instructed to follow the KLM down the same runway, exit it by taking the 3rd exit on their left and then use the parallel taxiway. Initially, the crew was unclear as to whether the controller had told them to take the 1st or 3rd exit. The crew asked for clarification and the controller responded emphatically by replying, "The 3rd one, sir. 1, 2, 3. 3rd one." The crew began the taxi and proceeded to identify the unmarked taxiways using an airport diagram as they reached them. The crew successfully identified the first 2 taxiways, but their discussion in the cockpit never indicated that they had sighted the 3rd taxiway, which they had been instructed to use. There were no markings or signs to identify the runway exits and they were in conditions of poor visibility. The Pan Am crew appeared to remain unsure of their position on the runway until the collision, which occurred near the intersection with the 4th taxiway. The angle of the 3rd taxiway would have required the plane to perform a turn of approximately 148 degrees, which would lead back toward the still crowded main apron. At the end of C3, the Pan Am would have to make another 148-degree turn in order to continue taxiing towards the start of the runway. Taxiway C4 would have required 2 35-degree turns. A study carried out by the Airline Pilots Association after the accident concluded that making the second 148-degree turn at the end of taxiway C3 would have been a practical impossibility. Subsequent performance calculations and taxi tests with a Boeing 747 turning off on an intersection comparable to the C3 at Tenerife, as part of the Dutch investigation, indicate that in all probability the turns could have been made. The official report from the Spanish authorities explains that the controller instructed the Pan Am aircraft to use the third taxiway because this was the earliest exit that they could take to reach the unobstructed section of the parallel taxiway. Weather conditions at Los Rodeos, Tenerife/Los Rodeos Airport is at 633 meters above sea level, which accounts for cloud behavior that differs from that at most other airports. Clouds at 6:00 a.m. above ground level at the nearby coast are at ground level at Los Rodeos/Tenerife North. Drifting clouds of different densities cause wildly varying visibilities, from unhindered at one moment to below the minimums the next. The collision took place in a high-density cloud. The Pan Am crew found themselves in poor and rapidly deteriorating visibility almost as soon as they entered the runway. According to the ALPA report, as the Pan Am aircraft taxied to the runway, the visibility was about 500 am. Shortly after they turned onto the runway it decreased to less than 100 am. Meanwhile, the KLM was still in good visibility, but with clouds blowing down the runway towards them. The KLM aircraft completed its 180-degree turn in relatively clear weather and lined up on runway 30. The next cloud was some 900 am down the runway and moving towards the aircraft at about 12 knots. Communication misunderstandings. Immediately after lining up, the KLM pilot advanced the throttles and the aircraft started to move forward. The co-pilot advised the captain that ATC clearance had not yet been given, and Captain Veldhuizen van Zanten responded, "I know that. Go ahead, ask." MERS then radioed the tower that they were ready for takeoff, and waiting for our ATC clearance. The KLM crew then received instructions which specified the route that the aircraft was to follow after takeoff. The instructions used the word takeoff, but did not include an explicit statement that they were cleared for takeoff. MERS read the flight clearance back to the controller, completing the readback with the statement, "We are now at takeoff." Captain Veldhuizen van Zanten interrupted the co-pilot's readback with the comment, "We're going." The controller, who could not see the runway due to the fog, initially responded with OK, which reinforced the KLM captain's misinterpretation that they had takeoff clearance. The controller's response of OK to the co-pilot's non-standard statement that they were now at takeoff was likely due to his misinterpretation that they were in takeoff position and ready to begin the roll when takeoff clearance was received, but not in the process of taking off. The controller then immediately added "Stand by for takeoff, I will call you," indicating that he had not intended the clearance to be interpreted as a takeoff clearance. A simultaneous radio call from the Pan Am crew caused mutual interference on the radio frequency, which was audible in the KLM cockpit as a 3-second long whistling sound. This caused the KLM crew to miss the crucial latter portion of the tower's response. The Pan Am crew's transmission was "We're still taxiing down the runway, the Clipper 1736. This message was also blocked by the interference and inaudible to the KLM crew. Either message, if heard in the KLM cockpit, would have alerted the crew to the situation and given them time to abort the takeoff attempt. Due to the fog, neither crew was able to see the other plane on the runway ahead of them. In addition, neither of the aircraft could be seen from the control tower, and the airport was not equipped with ground radar. After the KLM plane had started its takeoff roll, the tower instructed the Pan Am crew to report when runway clear. The Pan Am crew replied, "OK, we'll report when we're clear." On hearing this, the KLM flight engineer expressed his concern about the Pan Am not being clear of the runway by asking the pilots in his own cockpit, "Is he not clear, that Pan American?" Veldhuizen van Zanten emphatically replied, "Oh, yes," and continued with the takeoff. Collision. According to the CVR, the Pan Am pilot said, "There he is," when he spotted the KLM's landing lights through the fog just as his plane approached exit C4. When it became clear that the KLM was approaching at takeoff speed, Grubbs exclaimed, "Goddamn, that son of a bitch is coming straight at us." While the co-pilot Robert Bragg yelled, Get off. Get off. Get off. The Pan Am crew applied full power to the throttles and took a sharp left turn towards the grass in an attempt to avoid a collision. By the time the KLM pilots saw the Pan Am, they were already traveling too fast to stop. In desperation, the pilots prematurely rotated the aircraft and attempted to clear the Pan Am by climbing away, causing a severe tail strike for 20 am. The KLM was within 100 am of the Pan Am when it left the ground. Its nose gear cleared the Pan Am, but the engines, lower fuselage and main landing gear struck the upper right side of the Pan Am's fuselage at approximately 140 knots, ripping apart the center of the Pan Am jet almost directly above the wing. The right side engines crashed through the Pan Am's upper deck immediately behind the cockpit. The KLM plane remained briefly airborne following the collision, but the impact with the Pan Am had sheared off the outer left engine, caused significant amounts of shredded materials to be ingested by the inner left engine, and damaged the wings. The KLM immediately went into a stall, rolled sharply, and hit the ground at a point approximately 150 am past the collision, sliding a further 300 am down the runway. The full load of fuel, which had caused the earlier delay, ignited immediately in a large fireball. A survivor of the Pan Am flight, John Coombs of Haleiwa, Hawaii, said that sitting in the nose of the plane probably saved his life. We all settled back, and the next thing an explosion took place and the whole port side, left side of the plane, was just torn wide open. Both airplanes were destroyed. All 234 passengers and 14 crew members in the KLM plane died, as did 326 passengers and 9 crew members aboard the Pan Am, primarily due to the fire and explosions resulting from the fuel spilled and ignited in the impact. The other 56 passengers and 5 crew members aboard the Pan Am aircraft survived, including the pilots and flight engineer. Most of the survivors on the Pan Am walked out onto the left wing, the side away from the collision, through holes in the fuselage structure. The Pan Am's engines were still running for a few minutes after the accident despite First Officer Bragg's intention to turn them off. The top part of the cockpit, where the engine switches were located, had been destroyed in the collision, and all control lines were severed, leaving no method for the flight crew to control the aircraft's systems. Survivors waited for rescue, but it did not come promptly, as the firefighters were initially unaware that there were 2 aircraft involved and were concentrating on the KLM wreck some distance away in the thick fog. Eventually, most of the survivors on the wings dropped to the ground below. Captain Veldhuizen van Zanten was KLM's chief of flight training. His photograph was used for publicity materials such as magazine advertisements, including the in-flight magazine on board PHBUF. As such, KLM suggested that he should be part of the investigation team, before learning that he was the captain involved. He had given the co-pilot on the flight his Boeing 747 qualification check about 2 months before the accident. Investigation: about 70 crash investigators from Spain, the Netherlands, the United States, and the 2 airline companies were involved in the investigation. Facts showed that there had been misinterpretations and false assumptions. Analysis of the CVR transcript showed that the KLM pilot was convinced that he had been cleared for takeoff, while the Tenerife control tower was certain that the KLM 747 was stationary at the end of the runway and awaiting takeoff clearance. It appears KLM's co-pilot was not as certain about takeoff clearance as the captain. Probable cause: the investigation concluded that the fundamental cause of the accident was that Captain Veldhuizen van Zanten took off without takeoff clearance. The investigators suggested the reason for his mistake might have been a desire to leave as soon as possible in order to comply with KLM's duty time regulations, and before the weather deteriorated further. Other major factors contributing to the accident were: the sudden fog greatly limited visibility. The control tower and the crews of both planes were unable to see one another. Interference from simultaneous radio transmissions, with the result that neither message could be heard. The following factors were considered contributing but not critical: use of ambiguous non-standard phrases by the KLM co-pilot and the Tenerife control tower. The Pan Am aircraft had not exited the runway at C3. The airport was forced to accommodate a great number of large aircraft, resulting in disruption of the normal use of taxiways. Dutch response: the Dutch authorities were reluctant to accept the Spanish report blaming the KLM captain for the accident. The Netherlands Department of Civil Aviation published a response that, whilst accepting that the KLM aircraft had taken off prematurely, argued that he alone should not be blamed for the mutual misunderstanding that occurred between the controller and the KLM crew, and that limitations of using radio as a means of communication should have been given greater consideration. In particular, the Dutch response pointed out that, the crowded airport had placed additional pressure on all parties, KLM, Pan Am, and the controller. Sounds on the CVR suggested that during the incident the Spanish control tower crew had been listening to a football match on the radio and may have been distracted. The transmission from the tower in which the controller passed KLM their ATC clearance was ambiguous and could have been interpreted as also giving takeoff clearance. In support of this part of their response, the Dutch investigators pointed out that Pan Am's messages "No. And we are still taxiing down the runway," the Clipper 1736, indicated that Captain Grubbs and First Officer Bragg had recognized the ambiguity. The Pan Am had taxied beyond the third exit. Had the plane turned at the third exit as instructed, the collision would not have occurred. Although the Dutch authorities were initially reluctant to blame Captain Veldhuizen van Zanten and his crew, the airline ultimately accepted responsibility for the accident. KLM paid the victims or their families compensation ranging between $58,000 and $600,000. The sum of settlements for property and damages was $110 million. Speculations: this was one of the first accident investigations during which the contribution of human factors was studied. The human factors included, the flight was one of Captain Veldhuizen van Zanten's first after spending 6 months training new pilots on a flight simulator, where he had been in charge of everything, hence having been away from the real world of flying for an extended period. The flight engineers and the first officer's apparent hesitation to challenge Veldhuizen van Zanten further. The official investigation suggested that this might have been because the captain was not only senior in rank, but also one of the most respected pilots working for the airline. This view is questioned by Jan Bartelski, a former KLM captain and the president of the International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations, who knew both men and believes that this explanation is inconsistent with his experience of their personalities. The reason only the flight engineer on the KLM plane reacted to the radio transmission "OK, we'll report when we're clear" might lie in the fact that by then he had completed his pre-flight checks, whereas his colleagues were experiencing an increased workload, just at the same time as the visibility worsened. The ALPA study group concluded that the KLM crew did not realize that the transmission Papa Alpha 1736 report when runway clear was directed at the Pan Am because this was the first and only time the Pan Am was referred to by that name. Before that, the Pan Am was called Clipper 1736, with the proper call sign. The extra fuel the KLM plane took on added several factors. It delayed takeoff an extra 35 minutes, which gave time for the fog to settle in. It added over 40 tons of weight to the plane, which increased the takeoff distance and made it more difficult to clear the Pan Am when taking off. It increased the size of the fire from the crash that ultimately killed everyone on board. Safety response: as a consequence of the accident, sweeping changes were made to international airline regulations and to aircraft. Aviation authorities around the world introduced requirements for standard phrases and a greater emphasis on English as a common working language. For example, ICAO calls for the phrase "line up and wait" as an instruction to an aircraft moving into position but not cleared for takeoff. Also, several national air safety boards began penalizing pilots for disobeying air traffic controllers' orders. Air traffic instruction should not be acknowledged solely with a colloquial phrase such as "OK," or even "Roger," but with a read back of the key parts of the instruction, to show mutual understanding. Additionally, the phrase "takeoff" is spoken only when the actual takeoff clearance is given. Up until that point, both aircrew and controllers should use the phrase "departure" in its place. Cockpit procedures were also changed. Hierarchical relations among crew members were played down. More emphasis was placed on team decision-making by mutual agreement, part of what has become known in the industry as crew resource management. In 1978 a second airport was inaugurated on the island, the new Tenerife North Airport. This airport now serves the majority of international tourist flights. Los Rodeos, renamed to Tenerife North Airport, was then used only for domestic and inter-island flights, but in 2002 a new terminal was opened and it carries international traffic once again, including budget airlines. The Spanish authorities installed a ground radar at Tenerife North following the accident. Memorials. A Dutch national memorial and final resting place for the victims of the KLM plane is located in Amsterdam, at Westgard Cemetery. There is also a memorial at the Westminster Memorial Park and Mortuary in Westminster, California. The 30th anniversary marked the first time that Dutch and American next of kin, and 8 helpers from Tenerife, joined in international commemoration service held at the Auditorio de Tenerife in Santa Cruz. The International Tenerife Memorial March 27, 1977 was inaugurated at the Mesa Mota March 27, 2007. The monument was designed by Dutch sculptor Rudy van der Wint. Notable victims: Eve Meyer, a pin-up model, film actress and producer and former wife of Russ Meyer, was on the Pan Am. A.P. Hammond, the former city manager of San Jose, California, and his wife Frances Hammond, were also on the Pan Am. Documentaries. The disaster has been featured in many TV shows and documentaries. These include the Mayday special episode Crash of the Century, the Survival in the Sky episode Blaming the Pilot, the Seconds from Disaster episode Collision on the Runway, PBS's Nova episode The Deadliest Plane Crash in 2006, the PBS special Surviving Disaster, How the Brain Works Under Extreme Duress in 2011, and the Discovery Channel TV series Most Deadly and Destroyed in Seconds. See also, 1972 Chicago O'Hare runway collision, a similar accident that was far less deadly, Linate Airport disaster, a runway collision that occurred in Milan in 2001, killing 118 people, Madrid runway disaster, a runway collision in Spain that took the lives of 93 people, USAIR Flight 1493, a runway collision at LAX in 1991 that killed 34 people. List of accidents and incidents on commercial airliners grouped by year. References. External links. Official Spanish and Dutch accident reports, Human Factors Report on the Tenerife accident, Airline Pilots Association of the United States, Project Tenerife, a website about the disaster at Tenerife.